I never thought that I would call 9:20 in the morning early, but it feels early this morning, I tell you, having just flown in from New York a few days ago. I'm going to take a little bit of a different approach and give you a little bit of different perspective from a P&I Club with regard to environmental regulations, particularly as they relate to those in the United States. The United States in particular has very strict guidelines and requirements and also enforcement capabilities, and they do so with vigor, as we well know, okay? And as some of you actually may know and hear about in the news and in the press. But, oops, I went wrong direction. So just briefly, I'm going to talk about these few points, just an overview, given I have very short time in which to discuss them. Really talk about the realities of marine pollution, which we know quite a bit about, okay, as they relate to the general perspectives of what pollutes in the U.S., as well as where they point their attention in the U.S. on the ship-owning community. Just brief comments about port state control and marine pollution and the focus of that. Also the history of oily water separators and some of the problems that we've seen with that, particularly on the violations and the enforcement side. And we still see that this is an issue. But also expand and discuss the range of environmental requirements for ship owners that we see in the United States. We've seen a growth of it. We've seen early implementation of certain issues. We've seen the ECA come into effect recently, the requirements under the North America ECA, and I'll just touch on those briefly. And I can never have a discussion without talking about the human element aspects of whether it's environmental issues, safety issues, security issues, they all have their impacts, and I will touch a moment on that and some of the problems and concerns we continue to see in our industry there. And also just briefly give an overview on the foreseeable trends and risks that we see in the U.S. in particular. Realities of marine pollution, we all know, and much to the chagrin and frustration of our industry, 80% of marine pollution comes from land-based sources. We see that, we see effects of it. In particular, what we call, and in the United States, the most significant part of that comes from what we call non-point source pollution. They come from fertilizers, they come from herbicides, pesticides, primarily from runoff, farming runoff, septic tank systems, and so on, as you see that I've listed here. Airborne contaminants, that basically air pollution that, of course, due to precipitation, then goes onto the ground and into the water and into the marine environment. Motor vehicles, heavy metals. I'm not talking about the heavy metal music, which is also a form of pollution, but I'm referring particularly about heavy metals actually in their actual form. It's interesting because we know that, in particular our industry, which is very difficult, which is very simple, it's very easy to target our industry, maritime industry, because we are what they term as a point source form of pollution. We see it, we see the ships, we see the stack emissions, we see periodic pollution cases and history of oil pollution and so on. It's a very easy target for what is considered a point source point source pollution or authorities. Criminal prosecutions and fines are severe in the United States. We have seen that. We read it in the newspaper. We know of some of our friends in this community and the maritime community here in Greece have been affected by this directly, as well as elsewhere around the world. It is significant. It is a constant threat to our industry. What I would like to talk about just real briefly is, I think, is a very interesting point, and I've been thinking about this before preparing this presentation, was really thinking about how this is all expanded into our industry, where I think that we could always argue where it actually started. We could say it started with the Exxon Valdez and post-Exxon Valdez with the Oil Pollution Act of 1990. At that point in time, there was a lot of focus, of course, on oil pollution from ships and the ships as a cargo, okay? Since that time, we've seen an expansion in all types of areas, okay? Oil pollution from bilges, of course, as it relates to oily water separators and the like, and magic pipes that we've heard them called, that has been an issue. Bunker fuel, okay? Now with the new bunker convention and a focus on bunker due to the size of ships and the size of, and the volumes of bunker fuel, that heavy fuel oil, that can be more dangerous than a crude oil spill of a much larger size, depending upon where it actually occurs. We've seen that. We've also seen the expansion and interest in the other parts of the MARPOL Convention, looking at garbage, sewage, noxious substances, of course, invasive species with the ballast water, as we've just heard from Mr. Fidelis from ABS, brief summary of where we're going forward with that. Air pollution, NOx and SOx emissions. I put CO2 there, not a lot of energy put into requirements for ship owners for that at this point in time, but NOx and SOx have become quite an issue, and particularly SOx, as we've seen, particularly with the amendments for and most recently, at least in the US, as it relates to North America, ECA. And what I'd like to call at the very end here, what we call holistic set of pollution sources, of which I'll talk just briefly, mention the vessel general permit, US EPA requirements of basically everything on board ship, of any type of source that would be considered a potential pollution source. So it has expanded dramatically over the years. We are in the process of evaluating and trying to keep members, our ship owners, informed of how stringent the requirements will be enforced as they are expanded. But it's very important for us to make sure that we're keeping ship owners aware of what is actually required within the U.S. Just briefly, just want to make a point. It is obvious, it's clear, probably didn't even put the slide in here. Clearly, the U.S. Coast Guard takes environmental matters into serious consideration as they are doing their port state control inspections. And they monitor it quite frequently. My apology, I didn't see the 2014 report, but it's very clear, the annual report from the U.S. Coast Guard and the port state control, that environmental matters in general terms feature at the top of their list, first, second, or third, and I'm sure the 2014 is probably first or second again, okay? And I think it will continue to do so as there are more environmental pressures in the U.S. or environmental regulatory pressures in the U.S. The reason why I want to just mention briefly the oily water separator cases is that we have seen a number of them, particularly from P&I perspective. We are not in a position where criminal violations, we can pay for criminal violations, although we've been presented with certain cases and looking at certain elements of these cases for reimbursement to members on a case-by-case basis. But the reason why I want to bring this up is that it continues to happen in our industry, okay? We see, when I was looking at most recent cases, I pulled up these cases that you see here in the middle with the Columbia Ship Management, Pacific International, H.Moore. These are happening still, even now, 2013, 2014, despite the fact that the first of these cases we've seen in 1994, and they are still occurring. There's still pressures on ship owners and crews. There's still a cultural issue within our industry, okay, for better or for worse. There's still a cultural issue with regard to seafarers as they violate and are looking for a payout, depending upon their backgrounds. And we know we've seen certain cases where ship owners have done everything that they can. And despite all that effort, that the violations are occurring and that the fines are being levied. So, what the most, or very recently, particularly from our perspective, and a lot of the feedback that we've received from ship owners who come to the U.S. regularly, as well as ship owners who actually come to the U.S. infrequently, are always asking us, can you give us a general overview of what the requirements are for ship owners? for compliance with regulations in the U.S. We do have an issue with regard, we are the United States. The United States was founded, unfortunately, in certain ways on states' rights. So despite the fact that in the U.S. they try to come up with one single solution, individual states can do what they wish. And we have seen, and as mentioned also by Mr. Fidelis earlier, about the what's going on in California, my home state, not my home state anymore, but my home state. Continual additional requirements. We see that in other states from time to time, depending upon what occurs. But what we've focused attention on, particularly as it relates to environmental matters, we produced recently a Welcome to the United States, which we update periodically for our membership. But we most recently focus on these particular subjects. Of course, all the annexes of MARPOL, 1 through 6. Vessel General Permit. I don't know how many of you may have had an experience with that. That has become a big issue for us, okay, and we see enforcement extending upon that particular concern with regard to 26 various sources of pollution which need to be monitored, which need to be documented, and continual efforts put at ensuring compliance, as well as these other matters which are noted here, which I'm sure I could go into more detail, but I've just been told now I have about 30 seconds in which to speak. Just briefly, we talk about this all the time. Management, oversight, culture, crew competency, crew selection, training. Particularly from our perspective, we've now spending a lot of time and energy and focus on the concept of training as it relates to environmental compliance, particularly for ship owners. We do a lot of that in our efforts these days. And it's important for us from the P&I Club perspective that the types of claims that we see, the trends that we hear, we are basically recipients of a lot of information and can do that. I've been given my time. I will just close with this slide. I will not say anything about it. I'm sure I don't need to say anything about it. There are all the matters that we see going forth. My apology. Yes.